Hello there, this is the 4.03 lesson, Eisenhower at the helm. By 1952, the United States was mired in another conflict, and Americans were looking for a firm, steady hand to see them through it. Former General Dwight D. Eisenhower emerged as that leader. How would Eisenhower approach the Cold War? Secretary of State John Foster Dulles urged him to be prepared to go to the edge of nuclear war, brinkmanship. Eisenhower, a career military man, understood the need for strong armed forces, but when he left the presidency, he warned the nation of the danger to democracy from what he called a military-industrial complex. Goals for this lesson: recognize examples of U.S. covert action in third world countries and the reasons for it, describe the beginnings of the space race, and analyze Eisenhower's farewell address in terms of the military-industrial complex. Don't forget to go to lesson resources and grab your reading guide and your lesson answer key, and also the other sheet, Eisenhower's Caution. You'll be doing an activity with that. So we're going to start with reading pages 766 through 771, and let's go forth and do that now. Starting here with Eisenhower's Cold War. In the 1952 presidential election, the Republicans nominated Dwight D. Eisenhower, the former general who had served as supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe during World War II. A moderate Republican, Eisenhower enjoyed such widespread admiration that both Democrats and the Republicans tried to draft him as a candidate for president. Eisenhower was the grandson of farmers who moved to the West in the 1870s to claim a frontier homestead. He grew up in small-town Kansas. His father worked in a creamery. Let's X out of this. His father worked in a creamery but urged his 7 sons to attend college. After West Point, Eisenhower worked his way up through the army until Franklin Roosevelt made him commander of the Allied forces invading Nazi Germany. Victory in World War II made Eisenhower a national hero. Many American voters, frustrated over the Korean stalemate and anxious about Cold War tensions, saw Eisenhower as the answer to the nation's problems. A man who could restore, and here's pictures of the Eisenhower campaign, and one of his slogans was, "I like Ike," because that was his nickname, Ike. So, "I like Ike" was a popular campaign slogan. Okay, so for stability and maintain strength. His broad grin seemed friendly and inviting, and campaign buttons declared, "I like Ike." Eisenhower's running mate was the young California Senator Richard M. Nixon. In the campaign, Nixon went on the attack, vigorously blasting the Democratic candidate, Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson, soft on communism. Eisenhower won the 1952 election in a landslide. For the first time since 1928, a Republican occupied the White House. Let's go up here a little bit and read about Nixon and his checkers speech. Shortly after being chosen as Eisenhower's running mate, Richard Nixon's bright political future seemed threatened when a New York newspaper ran a story accusing him of accepting thousands of dollars in a private fund donated by wealthy supporters in California. Nixon responded in a nationally televised speech. With his wife by his side, he explained that the money was not for personal use, but was repayment of expenses. He described the modest circumstances of his upbringing. He said his wife did not wear mink coats, but a respectable Republican cloth coat. He acknowledged that he had accepted one gift. You know what it was? It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate, black, white, spotted, and our little girl Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers. And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog, and I just want to say right now that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it. Nixon's sentimental appeal turned public support in his favor and saved his place on the Republican ticket. All right, let's continue on. Rising nuclear tensions. A few months after Eisenhower's election, Joseph Stalin died. With the most ruthless of communist dictators gone, Winston Churchill wrote hopefully of a new breeze blowing in a tormented world. But the Cold War had entered a much more dangerous phase. By the time of Eisenhower's election, both the United States and the Soviet Union had developed a new form of nuclear weapon, the hydrogen bomb, with a destructive force hundreds of times greater than the atomic bomb. A Soviet scientist calculated that it would take a mere 100 hydrogen bombs to wipe out all life on Earth. Early in 1954, John Foster Dulles, Eisenhower's Secretary of State, spelled out the administration's Cold War policies. Dulles, who opposed Truman's policy of containment, called for a more vigorous response to the potential spread of communism. In the event of Soviet aggression, Dulles said, the United States would respond with massive retaliatory power to be deployed instantly by means and at places of our choosing. Because Dulles believed the Soviets could only be influenced by threats of force, he also argued the United States must be prepared to go to the brink of nuclear war. Critics attacked Dulles for his doctrine of massive retaliation and what they called his brinkmanship. In contrast to Dulles' aggressive rhetoric, Eisenhower, at least in his public statements, placed more emphasis on maintaining peace. He understood the terrible consequences of nuclear warfare. Atomic war will destroy our civilization, he said. War today is unthinkable with the weapons which we have at our command. At the same time, Eisenhower believed that the United States had to build up its nuclear arsenal to deter attack by the Soviet Union. He also favored building more nuclear weapons as a cost-saving measure, since it would be far more expensive for the United States to maintain a standing army large enough to offset what Dulles called the mighty land power of the communist world. As Eisenhower's Secretary of Defense, Charles Wilson, put it, with nuclear weapons, the United States could get more bang for their buck. The administration initiated programs to expand the nation's arsenal of hydrogen bombs and to develop new guided missiles, including ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, capable of delivering warheads to targets thousands of miles away. The Soviets built up their own stock of bombs and missiles. The arms race escalated as each superpower raised the nuclear stakes. Foreign crisis in a nuclear age. The United States continued to oppose communism around the globe through a combination of tactics, including both diplomacy and threats of military force. In so-called third world nations, the United States provided economic aid, sometimes to support business development and sometimes to fund anti-communist forces. The U.S. also stepped up its use of espionage and covert action, behind-the-scenes operations to influence foreign governments. During the Eisenhower years, the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, expanded dramatically in both numbers of agents and worldwide operations. The CIA's actions further complicated the already complex relations between the United States and Latin America. During Franklin Roosevelt's administration, the United States had adopted a good neighbor policy in which the United States promised not to intervene in the affairs of Latin American countries. But with the coming of the Cold War, the United States proved willing to intervene to stop perceived threats of communism, even if it meant supporting dictators. For example, in 1954, the CIA helped overthrow Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, the elected leader of Guatemala. Arbenz, who had the support of the Guatemalan Communist Party, tried to implement reforms that included taking over unused land owned by an American corporation, the United Fruit Company, the largest landowner in the country. The combination of communist support and a threat to American business interests prompted the CIA to arm and train forces that overthrew the Arbenz government. The overthrow of Arbenz led to deep anti-American feelings among Latin American countries and actually encouraged the growth of communist movements, such as in Cuba, discussed in a later chapter. In 1953, the CIA helped to overthrow the government of Iran when that country's prime minister, who was supported by the Iranian Communist Party, threatened to seize the holdings of a big British oil company based in Iran. Fearful of Soviet influence in this oil-rich region, the CIA supported a military coup that restored power to the country's former leader, the Shah of Iran. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. While the Shah adopted pro-Western anti-communist policies, he lived in luxury and ruled his people with an iron hand, thus breeding deep anti-American resentment among the Iranian people, which would later lead to violent repercussions against the United States. And let's look at this little picture here before we read on. Russian tanks in Budapest, Hungary, 1956. The Soviets crushed a rebellion and the U.S. refused to intervene. In other parts of the world, new crises emerged that demanded careful handling in order to avoid a nuclear catastrophe. In 1956, rebels in the Soviet satellite of Hungary, encouraged by American propaganda, overthrew their communist rulers. Soviet troops responded by invading the country, crushing the rebellion and killing thousands of Hungarians. The United States refused to intervene. Although Eisenhower said remorsefully that the U.S. had excited the Hungarians and then turned our backs on them, he was unwilling to risk a shooting war with the Soviet Union. In the same year, another conflict, this time in the Middle East, arose to test Americans' fundamental loyalties. Gamal Abdel Nasser, the nationalistic ruler of Egypt, seized control of the Suez Canal, a vital waterway linking the Mediterranean Sea with the Indian Ocean. In response, three of America's strongest allies, Britain, France, and Israel, invaded Egypt. Eisenhower, who feared the spread of Soviet influence in Egypt and other Arab countries, was furious that America's allies had launched an attack on Egypt without consulting the United States. How could we possibly support Britain and France, he asked, if in doing so we lose the whole Arab world? The administration found itself in an awkward position of opposing its longtime allies and siding with the Soviets to demand the withdrawal of the invading nations. The United States quickly took the issue to the United Nations, which called for a ceasefire and the reopening of the canal. Thus, American pressure helped compel the invaders to withdraw from Egypt. Most Americans praised Eisenhower for keeping the crisis from escalating into catastrophe. Despite Eisenhower's actions, the incident led to increased anti-Western and anti-American feelings in the Arab world. Eisenhower knew that the Middle East was an important front in the Cold War. In 1957, he asked Congress to approve what became known as the Eisenhower Doctrine, a commitment to send American aid and, if needed, U.S. troops to protect the Middle East from communist aggression. Congress granted his request. A year later, the president sent U.S. Marines to Lebanon to quell unrest after the overthrow of the country's government. Within a few months, when it became clear that Lebanon's government was stable, the troops left. Their deployment showed that the president was willing to back up his Eisenhower Doctrine with action. And let's read about Israel and the Middle East here before we move on. In 1956, when it allied with Britain and France against Egypt, Israel was a relatively new nation, born out of the long history of persecution of the Jewish people. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as anti-Jewish sentiment was on the rise in Europe, Jewish nationalists called Zionists worked to establish a Jewish state in the Middle Eastern region called Palestine, a strip of land bordering the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. After World War I, Palestine was placed under British control. The rise of fascism in the 20s and 30s caused many European Jews to emigrate to Palestine. More and more emigrated after Hitler's Holocaust to the dismay of the native Arab population who claimed Palestine as their homeland. In 1947, international sympathy for the plight of Jews and escalating ethnic tensions led the United Nations to propose dividing Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab. Jews welcomed the partition of Palestine, but Arabs strongly opposed it, and fighting followed. On May 14, 1948, when Israel raised its flag to declare its existence as an independent state, armies from Egypt and 4 other Arab countries invaded Israel. Israel beat back the Arab armies and seized some of the land the UN had set aside for Palestinian Arabs. Egypt and Jordan also kept some of the Palestinian lands they gained during the conflict. An uneasy armistice established temporary frontiers between Israel and its Arab neighbors. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War displaced more than 700,000 Palestinian Arabs. Many spent the next decades living in refugee camps. The war introduced new complexity and still unresolved tensions into an already troubled region. Okay, let's stop here before we begin on the space race, and we'll start that on the next video.